Ladies and gentlemen, it's another episode of Crow's Nest, and I'm here once again with Veeq7.
Hello, what's up?
What's up, dude? We're going to be talking about a couple of interesting topics that are they are about games, but they are not the game. So if that makes sense, basically, these are very literally meta topics, right? So basically, we're going to be talking first about freezing versions in a game that has an ever-evolving meta, you could say, for multiplayer. And the first point here is talking about discrepancies between single player and multiplayer. And this is something that Veeq and I were talking about, I think maybe 2 weeks ago or so. And we came to a little bit of a disagreement about initially what we wanted out of the experience, right? Because basically, I'll lay it out and you can talk about what your thoughts were, Veeq, and then we can sort of finish up the point A here. But point A is single player and multiplayer are necessarily going to have discrepancies. And especially with regards to like the way that the game state itself changes, you could imagine a game like League of Legends well, that doesn't have single player, so that's a bad example. But an RTS game, because that's what we're working on these days. You can imagine an RTS game. It has tech trees, right? It has races. And then something about those races changes because there's been a balance update. And so the multiplayer is changed in some noticeable way, say like 5 HP gets added to a unit or 1 damage gets added to a weapon or whatever. And these things are stuff that could certainly swing encounters or change your understanding of how threatening a unit is. And if we feel like that's a healthier state for multiplayer, that makes sense to change. However, I argue that it doesn't make sense to change a single player offline content piece like a campaign because realistically speaking, the single player campaign is released and finished when it's finished when it's released. Is considered done. That's how I want to interpret it. I don't want basically somebody playing the game, and obviously bugs don't withstand this lens, but you could imagine a case where like, okay, maybe it's possible to revise a single player mission to be better. Maybe it would even be better if it had a certain game state associated with it, but you are invalidating the past experience of somebody else who played the game earlier. And so you could imagine a scenario where somebody recommends you the game and their favorite mission was this, mission 10, because it was really difficult, really challenging. But, well, we changed it at some point. Now it's not as challenging. And the other guy comes away going, well, that was pretty easy, actually. I can't believe you thought that was challenging. And then it creates this whole misnomer, right? So it's not just that. That's like maybe an absurdist or extreme example of this phenomenon. But you can imagine playing a game and then going back to it a year later and trying to play the same thing that you really enjoyed or you knew something about was positive, and you go back and that thing is changed, and it could be a functional difference that makes it maybe worse for you subjectively. Maybe objectively it is better for like the game state, but it might not be as good, as compelling to you as when you first played it. And now you can never play that version of the game again because it's been updated. Or maybe you find like an older version online somewhere, but most often not, that's never going to happen. So this is sort of what I mean about freezing the version of single player content, is that when we release it, we want it to be considered done, well tested, well polished, ready to go in your sort of proverbial hands there as players, and you can do with it what you will. But the multiplayer side is a little bit more of an evolving sort of living text, living document where things are going to be revised and edited every now and then. Ideally, we'll be measured in this, and we'll get into that later on in the episode. But I think I've done an adequate job of summing up the differences here, where multiplayer is going to receive changes to some extent for some amount of time, whereas single player, we kind of want to keep things simple. So if you can talk a little bit about your thoughts against the point that I was making about single player and like what your concerns are, we can kind of lay out like the pros and cons of both approaches, if that makes sense, Veeq. So why don't you tell me what you think is maybe not as good of an idea, or what is negative about this approach? Because obviously there are pros and cons to this approach. So what was your major point of contention when I proposed freezing single player versions?
So yeah, there's what you described your point very well, and that is like one position that you can take, but the other one is sort of contradicting. It's like your point is like maximizing the enjoyment for recurring players, and it's also more maintainable. But what I wanted to propose initially was to keep updating the single player, which is obviously very costly, to the current game state, so we can have the best experience we can for new players, where they would learn some, like, you learn those like unit interactions and like dynamics of the game. When you learn a game state, they could have been significantly altered in multiplayer over time, and I was trying to not have that happen. But the problem that we observed is that it would be incredibly costly to maintain single-player content, basically having to redo it and break what Pr0nogo stood for, which is not breaking the experience for the recurring players.
I think the main point was definitely that we didn't want to break the experience for players. I didn't want to. You mentioned that obviously when we're dealing with, like, here's a case where a player is going to have a different experience. The new player plays the game, they play the campaign or tutorial or whatever, and then they hop into multiplayer, and suddenly like a unit is different, right?
Yeah.
You could easily imagine this case happening. That is a negative aspect that will be carried over here, but there are ways to mitigate this. And on top of it, I think the biggest death knell to the approach that you were talking about, or the biggest like sort of arrow in the knee or whatever, is that you don't have infinite amounts of time to constantly reinvent old content. And my position is that even if you did have that time, you shouldn't do it, because you want to have some permanence to the content that gets out there.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you did have that time, or like we just don't have the time to like constantly be working on old content, bringing it up to snuff and updating it and iterating on it or whatever. That's why I kind of wanted to consider it released and done, and then we can move on. And you know, we're pretty confident in our abilities to produce compelling content in the first place. We don't really worry about the idea that we're going to have to go back and remake a campaign later on to make it compelling or high quality. However, obviously standards will continue to rise as we get better and more competent as developers. So you can expect that later campaigns are probably going to be better than older ones. That still doesn't necessarily mean that we should be, you know, reinventing the old stuff. I actually think it helps you understand the journey that has been undertaken by the developers when you can experience the old content and see the growth therein. Maybe that's not as valuable for people who just want the best experience. This is another point in favor of the idea that if the game state is worse, or we see it as worse, then theoretically we would want that to be updated. But generally speaking, I think it is actually valuable to have that historical archive of content in terms of this is what our standards were like, this is what our quality level was at, this is how competent we were. These are also the tools we had at our disposal, and the game state is kind of a tool there. But we talked about, I think we, unless you have more thoughts on like how we arrived at the conclusion that we did, which is we're both basically in agreement. We don't want to be updating single player content perpetually. There are more net downsides to that than there are upsides. We should probably try to talk a little bit about mitigating the downsides then, right? Because the downsides are what you observed is that the new player is going to come in and, you know, have a completely different experience, right?
Initially, I have kind of hoped that we could achieve both means at the same time. And I kind of believe that we could have both without really having to commit a lot of time to updating the campaigns. But since we plan a lot of content, and we also while we don't exactly plan to massively shift multiplayer in the future, we do anticipate that things will change, and because of it, some maps of the single player could become really annoying to play, or maybe too easy, or etc. Yeah. And it would be a big problem. So we arrived at a conclusion that the least costly thing that also gives us most benefits is the first approach, where we just freeze the multiplayer. And then the way we have discussed about mitigating the issues is that maybe at some point we'll be revisiting single player at the moment when we also freeze multiplayer, which is something that we plan to do because we would want players to be able to figure out things, as opposed to like League of Legends, for example, where the game state shifts every 2 weeks and it's really hard to learn. Everything like flips on its head every season. Like it's very like the experience is very inconsistent, and the skills that are important are also inconsistent. You'll have to relearn entire roles very often.
Right. And so I think the main way to mitigate the disconnect between a new player playing single player and then them jumping into multiplayer is ultimately, I mean, the perfect world would be, oh, we released the game and it's perfect and there's no flaws and it's done. We don't need to worry about anything at all. But the main idea here is that we will eventually freeze multiplayer. The goal is not to enter into a perpetual update cycle the way that you were referencing those other games. It's like, not only is that not good for consistency, but it's not good for the developer either. Like, think about all of the new content or new games or new ideas that could be explored if like these developers weren't bogged down remaking old units, old champions, old whatever, editing old content basically and trying to get it up to snuff. There's an element of that where maybe it's not possible to, you know, achieve some sort of perfect balance. And, I think really what you want instead is these games are very far from that anyway, but you definitely want some idea of like, at least everybody has tools to succeed and it's up to them to take, use those tools. But more raw design ethics aside, the idea that you're going to be perpetually updating something just means you're busy always doing some amount of that instead of building something new, exploring some new things. And if you are ever exploring some new things through a high level rework, then you're also trashing existing content that can never be reclaimed again because most of these games are always online or whatever, and so you're never going to have an opportunity to play an old version of a champion or use an old version of a unit or whatever you can think of in this case that might be changed due to this perpetual update cycle. So what we want instead is to take measured approaches to the design and balance. And when we release a race or, in Onatar, which is the first game that first RTS game we'll be releasing, the main idea here is that we're going to just have 4 races. And so we're not going to be adding new content. We're not going to change up units or whatever perpetually. We're not going to be doing what we're going to do with Cosmonarchy Retail, which is eventually have 20 unique regencies, which are our version of races in that game. That we're going to only launch with 6, so we have to make 14 new ones. That's very different, and that means that maybe you will, enter into a world where this, regency comes in and it requires subtle changes in a bunch of other regencies, and then suddenly you're, looking at like maybe 20 units across the whole game being changed that are not even related to the ones that are being added. That could be something that ideally we wouldn't run into, but you could easily see that happening. That's a little bit more understandable for why you would update multiplayer. But if we can be measured about it, if we can really understand what we're changing and also see and visualize a goal of like what this content should be right out the gate, and then also couple that with good testers, and I don't just mean good in terms of the level of the game that they play, but also in terms of like the kind of feedback that they provide, and obviously us as designers being able to look at their actual gameplay and decide, does this match up with the feedback I'm getting? All of this is going to be really useful for tooling the initial content that gets released, the initial races or whatever, and making it so that whatever changes we do make or propose, we go through that testing phase. We make sure that it's what we want, and then we release it, and then we wait another, month or so before. Like, I would think a month at minimum, unless there's some really obvious error that we missed,
I think it's very important for us for our process to basically try our best to release finished content where we are sure we've done our job the best we could, that is well tested and it's ready to be used. But there are things that we have to be careful about, since there are very toxic interaction that we wouldn't want to happen. For example, we've discussed in private that, for example, we really wouldn't want the regency to only be played as a counter to another regency. We would want to have a balanced experience. And then after we do our job, we need to be very patient with what players can figure out. And then if we can identify the problem well, and we think we can fix it in a way that is not non-destructive to the game, then we will probably do that. But after a while, to be sure that the meta is somewhat figured out, and meta actually will develop for quite a long time, I think, because we have so much interactions in this game where we plan to have so many regencies and so many units that I think the game, it's very hard for the game to get solved. Even Brood War gets meta. New meta is being developed for Brood War, which is a 20-year-old game, which I think didn't have an update for 18 years?
Since 2001. Yeah, so it's over 20 years now, 21 years.
Oh yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's the thing that develops still to this day, and Brood War is actually quite simple to what we want to develop, and I think we'll have way more depth that players can interact with, which is our goal. And that will make it so the meta will be constantly evolving, I think, even after 20 years, like Brood War, and even more.
Well, the main thing that I imagine is going to happen is that people are going to see an initial, and this is something that you sort of saw in StarCraft 2, but obviously they always kneecapped the second phase of it. The first phase is sort of strategy develops and becomes adopted by professional level players or competitive minded players. And then phase 2 is there's eventually somebody who comes up with a counter to it or something that can do well against it if executed well as a strategy. And then, this dance goes back and forth where that's actually how you develop a meta is you theory craft solutions to problems, and the problems are whatever is good for my opponent, right? Whatever strategy they can deploy that seems like it's really difficult to deal with. And again, I think when you approach, I've seen people say that this is true about Dota 2, but I haven't played that game enough to be able to vet that claim. But the idea of basically always having a significant number of opportunities and tools that are very powerful. And I've heard that basically items and champions in the game are super powerful. And so if you have the idea that if you doesn't matter if there's something overpowered or, really powerful on one team, if the other team can have something else that's overpowered. And that's kind of how I view the idea of RTS units or strategies or whatever, is that there can be really powerful synergies on an RTS race. But if another race that is going up against that race has a similar kind of power available to them, maybe not in theme or in execution, but in terms of the actual power that it has to affect change on the map, then suddenly you can imagine it's fine that, I can, glass your entire base for 2,500 damage in a wide area. If you can, hit my entire army with a plague or something crazy like that. Like, there's many different realms that
it's
you
all
can
about balance,
approach
right?
it. Yeah, and that is my preferred method of balance as opposed to trying to achieve something that is like perfect or whatever that would even mean. It's kind of incoherent to me. But so the idea of freezing multiplayer is basically like, I'll be satisfied about the multiplayer version when it feels like there isn't an obvious, easy decision to make, where it's not like what you were talking about with races and regencies maybe being picked as a counter to another thing or something. Definitely don't want that. We want there to be a fighting chance no matter what matchup you're in and what map you're playing on. But it has to be dependent on your usage of the tools. And so we're not going to necessarily look at win rates for this. Yeah, we're not going to be looking at worrying about are the numbers up to snuff or pick rates and win rates and all that other stuff. Much more concerned about like those kinds of statistics are like asking questions that you have to go and answer. They're not the answer itself. So you really need to be taking those with a grain of salt as a developer, I feel like. And I do agree with the point that you made very strongly about the idea that you need to give players time to figure out what the problem is. Phase 1, a counter shows up. Phase 2, a counter to that counter shows up. And then how does this dance evolve? Ideally, there will be way more than just one strategy per matchup. But whatever the case may be, like, if something feels really powerful on one map or in one matchup or in general, is there something else that can be leveraged? And you won't know the answer to that as a designer. You won't know that as a professional player. You have to find out if there is an answer to that. And if there isn't an answer, that's when we would step in with a multiplayer change, with a balance change, right?
There is this observation that most players will miss, that actually, if you don't pitch about the meta and you actually look at the problems and try to solve them, you'll be surprised how far can you get if you just eliminate the assumption that the system is what is wrong. Because if maybe there's just like a design that doesn't really work well, but you can still probably find use for it, and you can probably figure out some solutions over time. And player base definitely will, since it's a competitive game. And you can actually develop very interesting things that maybe you haven't even anticipated. Since not everything will turn out as you intended, usually, because there's so much depth that you just can't anticipate as a designer, and not everything's so simple.
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a clip on my personal YouTube channel recently that's been making the rounds, and it's mostly just me talking about how StarCraft 2 developers didn't really know what they were doing. And I guess we can transition into that topic in general as game metas, right? Because that's sort of what we're talking about now anyway. But the reason I bring that clip up is because it's similar in notion to what you're saying. Is mine's a more negative version of it, but the general and more like clear-cut objective version is you can't understand what the game actually contains, what opportunities are there because of all the depth there. So as a designer, trying to attain some element of, perfection or trying to account for everything that can even be accounted for is fruitless and pointless when you need many, many like months or years of playing a game in order to figure out where the evolution is, right? And I mean, there's honestly an argument that maybe if there's something that's really unsatisfying about a particular matchup or what have you, maybe it would eventually be fixed by people finding a solution instead of being fixed by the developers, right?
Yeah.
Now, Brood War sort of has this with its maps being a stand-in for developers. But ideally, that's where like active developers who were actually able to tell you what their game was about and were actually able to understand what their game was about would be able to step in and like fix it so that it would work on any kind of, not any kind of map, but many kinds of maps instead of it requiring very specific things that are, I was trying to explain this earlier too. It's like in Brood War, there's islands, but island expansions always have to have 0 mineral fields so that Terrans can't land command centers there. And it's like, instead, maybe the game should just be balanced around the idea that Terrans can do that. And then the other races have their own ways of eking out economic advantages or positional advantages, and maps can be designed with that in mind or not, but they don't have to prohibit a mechanic of a race. You know what I mean? That would be ideal, I think. And so that's sort of what I mean when I say like the maps, there's certain characteristics of a good map, but I don't think it should contain things that are only there to prohibit mechanics or playstyles that are specific to one race as a hack job way of balancing things. So that's like a more specific example people that are listening might be able to recall off the top of their head if they've watched professional Brood War or even played on some of the ladder maps there. But that's sort of something silly that happens.
Zerg from Brood War are actually an interesting example of how problems get solved over time by community, because that race is super specific and it has a tough early game. But people have figured out matchups and how to actually deal with it. And Zerg is pretty competitive. Like, they are like pretty even with other races if you're skilled enough. I guess you could criticize that the gameplay of them feels really gimmicky and it's a bit like weird how they are played, but it actually is sort of balanced, right? It's just like as a designer you would think, oh, do we want Zerg to be played like this? And you would try to answer. You would probably actually want to answer a different decision, because if you already finished the game and it's up live, then you would want to see. You'd want to ask the question: Is this a problem that needs to be solved? Since like if it's really bad, then you would probably you could try to interfere as a designer and change them a bit. But if it gets figured out and it's you think it's healthy for the game, then it's great and it works.
Right. I mean, that's why to sort of wrap up our first point, freezing multiplayer eventually and just having it saying it's done is not only going to be good for us as developers because it lets us move on to making other games and other content. And it's also not the end of support for a game, because you think about all the things you can do once multiplayer is finished. You can maybe potentially something we talked about earlier, we might be able to revise the single player content so that there isn't a discrepancy after all. And we would just have that be you can always access the original version, but there's a director's cut version or something that has the latest multiplayer changes and maybe some small tweaks or whatever. Maybe we would do that. That's still on the table, but we're not decided. But the main thing that you can do is make new content. Here's the new content with the most up-to-date multiplayer because it's frozen and there's no changes coming. And, we're satisfied with it, but we can make content with it. Now you can play more single player, cooperative, whatever stuff. And obviously we could make more maps in general and stuff like that. So that could be really exciting. But not only is it good for us to be able to make new things, it's also ideal for, player expression, for consistency, for knowing the same way that I was saying, when you play single player content, you should have some confidence that it's going to be the same when you come back to it in a year. you should have some confidence in learning a race or a champion in League of Legends or a MOBA or something that, this is going to be around all the time, and maybe there's going to be meta changes for strategies for fighting your specific champion or race, but there's not going to be something from the game that just invalidates its existence. That's never going to be on the table. And yet, in most of these multiplayer games that have perpetual updates, that is exactly what happens. And so I guess that's our cue to take a look at some of those cases, right? And talk about why would you even want to do that in the first place? I sort of already touched on this, so I'm curious as to what you think about generally the idea of like when you're looking at League and StarCraft 2 and all these other cases, you're comparing it to Brood War, which we already said last updated 2001, like a shocking statistic considering it repeatedly gets updates or it gets repeatedly new metas and stuff. But obviously some part of that is due to the maps. So I am curious as to how your thoughts have evolved on this over time, because I used to play League pretty well. And then eventually, I was Diamond 2 or whatever, NA. So it doesn't, as if Diamond even matters in general, but it definitely doesn't matter because it's NA. But I will say that because of the fact that I was really heavily focused on jungling, I wasn't a one trick either. I had, 5-6 champions that I would play at that level. The main thing that turned me off from League was, they just overhauled jungle in one season and it was completely different. And I was like, well, literally throw all of the skills I learned into the dumpster. And yeah, as you're saying, they did it again recently. So that's just silly. But that's when I first realized that these perpetual updates are breaking a promise with the player, this implicit promise that you're always going to have some understanding of what the game is and how to play it. If you put in the work, you will be rewarded. It's more like if you put in the work, you'll be rewarded until we take that reward away and you have to do it all over again. That's the promise that League actually makes. And obviously StarCraft 2 is like this too, right? So what are your thoughts on these game metas as they get perpetually updated? Does that example bring to mind anything? Did you ever have these sort of competitive ambitions and have them be crushed away the way that I said it, or was it more subtle?
So yeah, there are definitely examples that I felt badly about it. It's mostly because like I sort of try to think about like, is it actually an objective improvement or not? And if it is, I'm often very happy. But if they did something that I think is a recession, which might be a bit subjective, they obviously don't have the same goals as I do, either as a designer or as a player, whatever the game we would be speaking of. But it is definitely really annoying when they do a change that like massively shifts something in a direction that you would rather avoid. Like, for example, StarCraft 2, they added more workers, which accelerated the early game a lot. And if you they basically eliminated the early game.
Yeah.
A lot of players that are micro heavy would like to have a timing attack that is pretty early on, or even like cheese a little bit. Now it's even more Rolini because it's just not optimal too much. Like there's this surprise factor that happens, but it's still not that optimal. And with the example of League, I also play jungle. I mean, I play a bit from time to time still, but they are reworking jungle. So I don't know. Well, we'll see how that works because they haven't shipped the update yet, but it doesn't look promising. It seems like they seem to be casualifying the experience, but there are some very negative changes where they reduce the skill ceiling, which I really dislike. But it also might add more champions for the role, so we'll see how that goes. But I do definitely agree that the more you change, the more players you will upset because they stayed with the game because they liked the way it was most often, right? So the more radical your changes are, the more people will turn away from you since it's just not what they subscribed for. Like it's the same thing with consistency in music. If a music starts well and you really like the style and then it shifts style completely to the opposite style, like let's say you have a calm music at the beginning with a really nice vibe, and then the second one is I don't know, rap or something. Just doesn't really if you like calm music, you wouldn't be listening to rap, right? And vice versa, probably.
And vice versa, yeah.
Yeah,
So that's the other
so-
thing is that, well, it's almost worse because in the case of League or StarCraft 2, the odds are you can never listen to that first part of the track ever again. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true. You
It's just
permanently
completely
are
gone.
just- yeah, exactly. I mean, with the example of League, it's I don't know. It's they fucked up a lot of things, and like
It doesn't seem like they're aware of it. Is the problem when I think about League, they seem to just be changing stuff. They're not open about it. They're not mask off about it. Blizzard literally had a patch note or community message update where they said we are going to change things for the sake of changing things. Like they were pretty obvious about it. They just accepted it.
You know what most people's argument is about frequent updates? They say that updates are good because they add variety. And you know what variety is? Micromission.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that. There's this age-old like reason or justification for micromissions being in an RTS campaign, and it's that they change the pace or add variety. And it's like, just like what Veeq said about music genres, if I'm playing an RTS, I don't want to start playing a point and click adventure or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, I signed up to play an RTS, so give me RTS missions, please give me RTS missions.
If you want to play a micro mission, then I mean the problem is that you're compromising, right? Like, the first thing is consistency, but the other thing is you're compromising. You could have a very amazing micro game like I mean Hades is not perfect, but if you want to play something like that, maybe you would play Hades. But if you feel like playing an RTS, then you would probably play StarCraft. And you might even would want like the original one making the decision, right?
Yeah, you might even play the original Dungeon Siege or something where you can control up to like 8 characters and it's all real time. Like that's more like a micro mission in a way.
Yeah, because you have more like if it's designed as a micro game, let's say, although the term could be replaced with something better, then you can add a lot more depth to it because you don't have this system that is just to know like in. Like if you take StarCraft units and put them into micro missions, they were not designed for micro missions. They are not that interesting because the whole point is that you have depth around the units, and it comes from interactions with the macro systems, and it's just gone in a micro mission, and it's a problem. It's usually replaced by gimmicks, which are not consistent. They are people seem to think that they are required, but the problem is. Maybe they even are, but the problem is it wasn't designed for it, so you don't have the systems at play. So you have to replace them with one-note gimmicks, or just not have them at all, and then just realize what the core experience of a micro mission is, which is just boring.
Well, it's basically hack and slash gameplay from like an ARPG or something, but you just don't like it's not a complete game is basically what you're getting at, is that they've removed design like mechanics and systems that occupied design space to complete the game, and then they haven't replaced it with anything, and even if they did, it would still be inconsistent.
You might subjectively like micro missions, but you would actually like something more with more depth way more if you just had it. Like if you have a game that is designed as a micro game where you just micromanage units or even a hero. Like, even an example of a MOBA is good, although that is a multiplayer, not PvE. But it's still, like, more designed around controlling a small amount of army or one character than a StarCraft Brood War was, right? So there are decisions that were made to optimize for RTS in Brood War, and there would be decisions being made to optimize for the single character experience in a MOBA, right?
However, I don't believe that there are very many decisions made that are optimizing for anything unless you have that goal in mind. And that's maybe the main problem with this perpetual update thing, is that I made the argument in that clip I was referencing earlier that the StarCraft 2 developers didn't know what they were doing. And that's to say that they made changes and then they invalidated or contradicted those changes in a later update. And like a classic example is if you look at bunker build times where they just jockeyed back and forth ridiculously. I think the barracks is the same way, actually. And so like some patches, they'd be 40 seconds and then down to 30 and then 35 and then 30 and 40 or whatever. It's like, dude, Just admit you don't know what you're doing.
The public release build as a testing ground.
Well, theoretically, they also had a testing ground, and I think they had a PTE and all this other stuff. So
yeah, but I don't think Blizzard really had good testers. Like they would be casuals essentially. So they wouldn't figure out build orders, so they just had to use the player base, which is
well. There's another implicit sort of contradiction to the perpetual update design as well, because StarCraft 2 was the first. In many cases, it's like or many ways, it's a test case for League. Both games have or had, in the case of StarCraft 2, a large casual player base, but they also have competitive scenes. And so now StarCraft 2 doesn't need to worry about this because its casual scene is mostly playing like co-op or whatever instead of the melee. But back in its heyday or whatever, StarCraft 2 had to balance casual play with competitive play, or thought they had to balance this. They decided to balance this. Fundamentally, it's not even the same experience, though, of course. It's more obvious in a team game, I guess, because in a team game, you're calming through voice the whole time, and you're running, strategies, and you've got picks developed, and you've scouted your opponent and all this other stuff. That's in competitive play. In just you queuing for ranked or whatever, it's completely different. You're just matched with whoever, and you gotta it's like a pickup game, right? It's like whoever gets here, whatever. You don't even pick your team. The game picks it for you, and that's fine. But that's a different experience than playing competitively. And these developers always seem to want to make it so that they're the same thing. And so they design thinking that they can design a compelling competitive game while also designing a compelling casual game, when it's not. Those two things are contradictory, right? So I think that's a pretty big issue here, is that one thing that constantly creates room for perpetual updates is the idea that, this thing is not quite perfect for competitive ladder, and we're going to change it. We changed it, and now it's conflicting with casual ladder, so maybe we need to find a compromise. And so now we got to combine these things or whatever. And StarCraft 2 had this problem. Now I think it's mostly just League or whatever. I'm not even really sure what they've said as far as a public stance goes on this, but most of these games, especially if they have developer-run professional circuits, use the professional scene as an advertisement for microtransactions for the base game. And so, of course, they're going to gear some element of development towards that, so that they can say, these champions that have skins that, are coming out, maybe we can update those or something. I don't know. Maybe we can balance them up a little bit or whatever. I'm sure that's happened before. There's all these sorts of perverse incentives where you're trying to advertise to the casuals, and you're trying to balance the play between casual and competitive. And I feel like that's definitely something that really kills these games. And I guess our stance on that is just that we're designing a game, and we want our game to be competitive and appeal to competitive minded players. And you can play it casually, but if you're low skill, or you're approaching it casually insofar as maybe you have skill, but you're not really that interested in dedicating yourself to the game, that's totally fine. Hopefully our system will match you against players that are of the same caliber, and you can have your lower skill or lower stakes fun and play games in that bracket of skill or whatever. You know what I mean? Hopefully that's what we can achieve, because that's a lot better than trying to design a game that's I don't even know what the term is. Is it fun if your game isn't competitive, but allows lower skill players to fight in more interesting ways? I don't even know what the allegation is. You know what
terrible I mean? Because then you don't have a clear path to improve. The game is balanced for you to suck, basically.
And the game changes all the time anyway, which also invalidates paths to improvement. So
I mean, it's funny. That League is even trying to be competitive. If it has a pool of skins that are literally banned from pro play because they're pay to win, but they and ranked games that people still can use those, and the game has RNG involved. It's really fun.
I just feel like the main thing that people are missing about game updates is that they have taken for granted that it's just the way things are, and that must be for a reason. But if you really look at trends in general, a lot of the times it's not for a good reason. You know, it's not like these people have all thought long and hard about whether their game should have perpetual updates.
It's funny that you bring it up, because I actually feel like people will defend the status quo for not much of a reason. Like, they got used to what games are, and they will just say that, oh, there's nothing wrong with this system, there's nothing wrong with that. But like, if you just don't want any change, then you will just always be stuck with companies copy pasting the game and having you pay for a new product that is really just the old product, but with a new flavor of visuals or something.
I mean, that's the main issue, is that you're like, well, it's maybe not the main issue. There's so many problems, and this is a very like rat's nest topic where we could get into a crazy sort of like series of go back and forth. Is this the biggest issue? Is that the biggest issue? Bottom line is, these kinds of conversations, they are a bit in the weeds, but I don't think many developers are having them. I don't think many developers are even aware that there's like a problem with just updating their game all the time. I think a lot of people have just, again, like the average like consumer or player, they've just accepted the idea that this is what happens. There's always something to edit and tweak. When what if there wasn't? Like, what if these people could stop perpetually updating their existing game and then work on a new one? And so, like, you know, live service games, maybe that's not the kind of game they are, but you could still imagine content updates, adding more maps or adding more champions in league. Or I still find it really weird that they only play on one map the whole game. Like, that's really silly. I think you could definitely take the game in a more interesting direction if you had maps and map vetoes and all that other stuff at the professional scene. And you would be able to do that if you finalize the roster of characters and finalize
I also
the
feel
balance.
like, you know, are you familiar with how dragons work in that game?
Well, I'm pretty sure they've changed like 40 times.
Yeah, they give you buffs, but they are the order of dragons is randomized, and the third dragon
is it still not in champ select?
Yeah, they're not in champ select.
Okay,
they are not told to you in champ select, which would be an improvement. But really, like, wouldn't you just like? I feel like you would just want to have an objective that if you gain, it allows you to choose the dragon, or maybe you would have like a voting system in lobby or something. No, I don't know.
Well, no, what should happen is that whoever kills the dragon should be able to, like, I don't know, then maybe an idea off the top of my head is that killing the dragon gives your team gold, and then you also get this droppable item the way that I think Rift Herald is. And if you escort that item back to your fucking home base, you get to pick what buff it gives you or something. I don't know. That would be at least more objective based. But that's also very different. And also, it's by far and away not the worst problem in that game. Yeah, the biggest issue, I think, in League, unironically, is the fact that you can lose the game in Champion Select. That's really embarrassing that that's a thing. Definitely. And that's obviously, you brought that up earlier, where we don't want regencies to be construed as like, you pick this race to counter that race. We never want that to be the case, but that is actually how it is in League.
The even bigger problem than what you said is losing the game before Champion Select. Because matchmaking is really bad, and it will match you with... You can, like, if you... The matchmaking system is really weird. I don't exactly know the details, but it seems like if you are playing well, it will often match you with really bad teammates, which will literally end, and the game's super snowbally, so it's really bad.
Yeah.
But, like, it's so often that you will just have inters, and you can't control it. Like, the only way to really... like, overcome that issue is to play enough games for that to not affect you, but you really just have to fucking grind. And it's really terrible. Because it's not about, being skillful or something, about improving. It's more about, like, oh, I just have to roll the dice enough times.
Well, I also have another clip out there talking about why League of Legends players tend to be more toxic than other games in general. At least that seems to be a sentiment shared by a lot of people who've played the game and interacted with other player bases. And I think the main issue is, as I go over in that clip, is that you're ranked, your stakes are different from player to player, from game to game. So your teammates might be in promo series and you're just like goofing off because this game doesn't matter for you. And that can be an easy, instant case where you are losing, or you're at least in a much more stressful situation than your fellow players, instead of it being like more sane in some way. I mean, you just probably wouldn't have promotional series to begin with. You just have elo systems and thresholds. But yeah, I don't know. League is a mess, and it'll never be frozen. Its multiplayer will never be finished. But you know, it's not the only game like that, is it, Veek? Because many games are not finished.
Every game now. It's really bad.
So I know you've actually been playing. Have you been playing Cyberpunk, or you've been talking about Cyberpunk with your friends or something?
I've played only a bit because I don't have a GPU that can really, where I could really play it for a long time. But
Cyberpunk is the new Crisis.
Yeah, I've read a lot about. I opened the game and I read like the skill tree and like I just saw the systems and the amount of RNG and like poor design decisions and like how little like you get to have so many decisions, but they are so meaningless, and it's really dumb. And like I don't know. I didn't really want to go deep into this, but basically the skill tree is super. Like it's super opportunity cost involved, where you can't even like mix multiple gun types if you want to be optimal, and then you also get a lot of RNG, and a lot of the design of the skills is like super bad. There's like a skill that you have to invest 3 skill points into to just increase the damage of rifles by 9%. And it's really just peak of design, I think. Like it's, I don't know. It's just I have nothing good to say about the game.
The main reason I bring it up in the context of the game being not finished is that we do want to talk about early access and about finishing your game. And it's obviously something that relates heavily towards what we talked about at the beginning when we were talking about, I mean, we talked about finishing multiplayer by freezing it or whatever. We also talked about releasing single player content and saying it's done, and how we want it to feel like that's not a compromise, that players who play this content will say, wow, this is good content. I appreciate it. I enjoy it. I got my money's worth. That's what we want out of our games and out of the content within our games. So we need to have some confidence. Like, we have some confidence in our skills to do that. However, it's almost a statement these days to be an indie developer, release a game that seems to have a lot of content, and have it not be early access. Because almost every game I stumble upon these days on Steam that fits the criteria of indie and seemingly full of content is always early access. And I do not like early access games precisely because if you play the game and you have a bad experience, they have an easy out. It's not finished. If you play the game and you have a good experience, that good experience might get fundamentally changed the same way we were talking about single player content getting iterated on would invalidate your past experience, or multiplayer content, whatever. And so I can't really see a positive end to it other than if you appreciate the core of the game and the developer doesn't, change that core too much as the game evolves, you will eventually be playing a similar enough game to what you liked once it's released, finally finished or whatever. Yeah. And I guess without the early access model, maybe that game wouldn't exist. So I can see that there are some niche cases where it's positive.
Yeah, sure.
In a more objective sense.
The biggest problem with early access is the same as pre-ordering. The developer gets rewarded before they actually finished, and people believe in them. But when they actually get paid, they realize that they kinda don't have to finish it because it's already a success, and that's happens a lot with early access game. I know a lot of early access games that have many years already, and they don't seem to even plan to leave early access ever. So,
yeah, I think Barotrauma qualifies there. I think it's still in early access. It's been over 5 years or something. I play a game called Nova Drift, which has been out for I think more than 2 years, and it's still technically in early access. So I actually enjoy playing that game, but I have the same misgivings in the sense that, it's something that when it gets updated, something changes. Maybe I don't have my preferred build or whatever anymore. It's a game where you customize your ship and stuff. So like, okay, cool. Maybe that doesn't work out in the same way. Maybe it changes. Maybe my fears are realized. Like, that's a case where I think if I look back, I probably wouldn't have made the purchase had I realized it was early access. I just bought it on recommendation for somebody else, and then, oh shit, it's early access. I kind of realized it after the fact.
Mm.
But yeah, like this is the worry that you have when you run into early access games. I think it also normalizes the idea that games are fine. It's fine to have a game not finished, but still being charged money for it. It's the same thing you said about pre-orders. But AAA games release not in an official state of early access, but really they're early access. You know what I mean? Like that's
just
Cyberpunk and all this other
realize
stuff.
that we will live in an age that where you can just they release a game, they can just update it, they can hotfix it, they never have to finish it because they can always just ship a patch. Before you had online updaters, you actually were buying a game, and the version you bought was the version you would play forever.
Yeah.
So they had to make the game finished to succeed, but now they don't, and that is kind of a problem. And a lot of people don't realize that, and it's a problem because, like, you vote with your wallet, and if you just buy the shitty games, the market becomes shitty games because there's demand on shitty games. Basically, you're creating profit for shitty games, and it's just gonna make more shitty games appear.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that point is basically exactly how I feel, where there's a significant, if you want to dig for a good game, you're going to be waiting a long time, and it's going to take a while. You're going to go through a lot of shitty games before you find something that is more valuable, right? And I think that's the biggest issue is like, in theory, early access might allow developers who can't afford to finish their game and then release it. They might allow for really good design to come out of that or whatever. I can imagine some indie developers who are down on their luck and don't have any money, and then they find a way to release it or whatever. I can see the positive example in my head, but the problem is it is reinforcing this mechanism that you just described, where I can finish my game later and charge you for it now, and maybe charge you for the final version or a DLC or whatever. Like, this is the main issue with DLC way back when it started in the whatever console generation, the Xbox 360 and PS3 and stuff. When DLC was first rearing its head, instead of you getting expansion packs or sequels, you would get downloadable content that would be map packs in a shooter like Halo or Gears of War or Call of Duty. You would get, new campaigns or new content or whatever in Mass Effect, stuff like that. That DLC was, in many respects, felt like you were finishing the game later and charging players for it. At the very least, you were taking things that the player used to get for free or used to get for the same price but in a much higher quantity, and charging them more piecemeal for it. There's a deleted scene Gears of War 2 DLC that when it launched, I think was $20, and I'm pretty sure it was less than an hour of content. And that's the kind of thing, the base game was 60 or 50 or whatever at launch. This is American prices and before the modern inflation. So just imagine that. Imagine spending $50 to $60 for the base game, which is maybe 10 hours at most of a single player campaign, and then paying $20 or whatever, $15, $20 for 1 hour, 2 hours max.
I think that it is a big problem that DLCs are very overpriced. The amount of cost they actually do to release them is really low. Usually, most games just add a bit more content, don't really revisit anything, don't really add many designs. And they charge you a lot of money for those, even though they are made on a ready engine with already established lore, story, world.
Yeah, the hard part's done. The game's finished. Now we're going to use assets that we already made in an engine we've already made or are using, in without needing to write completely new lore and stuff. That's what I mean, is that the quality or the amount of value per dollar has gone down dramatically. And the idea is the amount of content you're getting, or the perceived amount of content within a DLC or whatever, is so far less than the old expansion packs. I know we talked about Brood War a lot in this episode, but it literally, it almost doubled the length of the campaign, the single player experience. And it was less than the full price of the first game, I believe, when it came out. Although I don't remember exactly because I bought it. I bought Brood War so many different times, so I can't remember what the actual price was. But it wasn't even if it was the same price as the original game, it's the same amount of content as the original game. I mean, it's not really. It's just campaigns. It's not to your point about it's the same engine and same everything else. And also to another point, it's it can be even more sinister than that, because maybe this is content that was originally supposed to be in the game and they didn't have time to finish it, so they cut it and then they finish it afterwards.
Yeah,
like
and
that happened with Gears of War twice. So yeah, so
yeah,
it can happen. Ultimately, I think the main point here, and the reason why this episode is called Perpetual Access, is I don't think that early access is a great thing for the industry, but I also don't think it's like the latest in a long trend of like reducing the value for the customer. There's a quote somewhere, I can't remember where I heard it, but it's the industry has bypassed their responsibility to the consumer. And I think that is incredibly trite and specific and correct. It's like they've found a way to be perfectly they found a way to be exactly what you want, like what the money bags wants, without being at all worried about what the consumer wants. Like at this point, they've shifted the Overton window so much that like you said, market demand for shitty games. Here you go. Shitty games. And you're not going to get anything else. You're not even going to get finished games. Like, man, that's crazy. So, and I guess I'll say this title, this episode might be called "Finish Your Game." We'll see. That's my interjection. But yeah, I feel like the industry bypassing their responsibility to the developer, or to the consumer rather. I think that quote is pretty appropriate. I think when you understand that the consumer at this point doesn't really have, like, they're not thinking outside of the box, which is fine for the average person, but their box has progressively shrunk since the original incarnation of video games, of popular video games, of this version of the industry, back in, say, like the mid 90s to early 2000s or whatever. It's like the amount of content you're getting in most of these cases is pretty slim. So hopefully we can push back against that. Hopefully we can have, DLC that is more like an expansion pack. We're even calling it expansion packs. Hopefully people will see that there's a lot of content in there for small amount of money comparatively. So
I hope we outcompete other companies by just making quality games, and then the demand for quality games increases and we just get more quality games. I hope that's how it happens.
Yeah, that's the white-pilled, super optimistic outlook on the idea, is that if a couple of us visionaries, if you want to call us that, a couple of us trailblazers try to say, hey, here's quality games over here, and you redefine what quality game even means to the average person, then yeah, hopefully they do start to demand higher quality for other developers. And it's a snowball effect in a positive sense.
Yeah. Positive spiral.
Positive feedback loop. Fuck yeah. I like that. So yeah, I mean, that could also be the name of this episode. But I suppose I will say at the end, there was somebody who reached out to us, because I feel like this is do you have an idea for any other topics or any other things you wanted to say? Because I feel like this is probably the end of the episode.
Yeah.
Okay. There was somebody who came up, he sent us an email. They are part of a 2-man team working on a game called Byte Lynx, and apparently it is coming out soon. I think on the 10th, and we're recording this on the 8th. So
yeah, I think NDA is on the 10th and release is on the 12th.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the 12th, by the way, of October, they will release.
By the way.
And they will, it's an RTS that doesn't have units. So I think that's really all we can say about it, because you've played a little bit of it, and I haven't played it at all yet. And we might talk about it more in depth on the next episode. But I did want to at least mention them here, because it's unlikely we will release the next episode of this show before the game releases. But they did ask us, or they did at least email us about the game, and I feel like, whatever, we might as well mention it. So
yeah,
I guess I'll link their Steam page in the description of this video. It's weird. We've never done content where it's like, hey, we're our own independent development team. Here's another independent development team's game. I don't know anything about the game. It might be terrible. It might be great. You'll have to decide that for yourself. But apparently all you need for a shout out is to email me. So I guess, or email contact@fraudsclub.com more specifically. So there you go. That's PSA.
Maybe
for
we also get
developers.
inspired by something. That would be great.
Yeah, that is true. Like I haven't played the game. Maybe I haven't played the game yet. I will eventually do it. That we were sent pre-release keys. I suppose I should have led with that because there's like rules about YouTube where it's like paid sponsorship or whatever. We weren't paid. We were just given keys. But that's sort of like early access or exclusive access or whatever. Anyway, the point I'm making is maybe we'll play these games from indie studios and find that are related to the RTS genre and find something interesting that we can incorporate to ourselves. So if your game is in or around that genre, then and you want us to take a look at it and talk about it, then no promises that we can say positive things about it because that would require it to be a positive game. But we might get something out of it anyway.
Stay objective and core to our values.
Yeah. So that doesn't mean that we don't wish success upon these people. But I mean, I guess if they made a terrible game, then we don't wish success upon them because we wouldn't want to reward that practice as more than the industry already does. But you get the idea. So yeah, I guess that's it.
We wish them good luck.
Wish them good luck. There you go. That's what you can say. Good luck and
try your best to make a good game. Yeah.
Finish your game.
Oh yeah, Come exactly.
On, yeah, finish your game. Positive feedback loop and perpetual access. Buzzwords.
Yeah.